Well, let's start there. I have a bunch of questions for you about your background, but let's pursue
Mhm.
this idea of starting with setting just a little bit, because I want to talk a lot about Everlasting Nora. But I know that you had said that it was. Trying to remember the exact holiday that you were at where you saw a cemetery and it gave you the idea to start All Saints Day, right? You were in the Philippines and you saw All Saints Day, and that kind of gave you the initial seed of the idea for Nora Everlasting. Do I have that kind of in the ballpark, right?
That's true. That was the initial inspiration. I started out actually in my writing career. I started out writing picture books. Um, I'm not one of those writers that grew up wanting to be a writer. I did writing, as a child. I wrote in my diaries. I did school projects and things like that. But I never imagined myself uh, as a writer. And I think it's big. It's a cultural thing because when I was growing up, what you wanted to be, your folks around you would say, you're going to be either a doctor, a nurse, a lawyer, an engineer. Those are the accepted careers, basically. To be an artist or to be a writer wasn't something that was, looked upon as a possibility, for me when I was growing up. So I didn't grow up wanting to be a writer. And when I was older and I had my kids and we were going to the bookstore, I was, looking at the shelves and shelves of books, and I saw these beautiful picture books of, I think one was written by Linda Sue Park, and it was gorgeous. And I thought, I don't see any books with Filipino children. I don't see books with Filipino culture or stories that came from the Philippines. And I thought to myself, there really should be books for, Filipino American kids and for all American kids, because they're going to have Filipino friends, to get to know them as people, to know where they are from, and to understand them a little bit better. And so that's how I started out. So I had this great, so I was writing picture books. I had this great idea that about these, pair of brothers that would on the night of All Saints Day, because in the Philippines, All Saints Day, we would go to the cemeteries at night. And that sort of freaked me out because when I first moved to the Philippines, it was right before Halloween. And I was really bummed that we weren't going to be, they didn't celebrate Halloween in 1977. That kind of tells you how old I am. Yeah, and so I was really bummed, back in 1977 when we moved to the Philippines that they didn't have Halloween. And my cousin said, "Oh, we're going to do something better. We're going to go to the cemetery." And I thought, "Why?" And they said, "Oh, All Saints Day is when you go and you celebrate, your loved ones who had passed away. So we're going to go visit them in the cemetery." And I go, "Oh, okay." And I waited the whole day to go to the cemetery, and we didn't go. And then finally, around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they said, "Oh, let's go." I go, "Oh, but it's going to be dark soon." I said, "Yeah, that's when we all visit." And so, but the cemetery, it wasn't, you'd imagine it was scary, a place that was scary looking, or dark, especially at night. It wasn't. It was actually something of a festival. And the way we celebrate it in the Philippines is very much how Dia de los Muertos is celebrated in Mexico. We have candles, the tombs. The cemeteries in the Philippines are above ground, so what you see are like sarcophagus. They're above ground tombs. There are places that have the traditional type of cemeteries where it's just green grass and everyone is buried underground. Over there, they're all buried in these, above ground tombs. So the whole place is just cement blocks. That's all you see, really. And on the night of All Saints Day, it is alive. I mean, there's lots of people. There are, all the candles are burning, in front of the tombs. People are sitting there with their snacks. There are actually food vendors going up and down the streets of the cemetery selling their wares. So it was very festive. And one of the things that my cousins did while we were sitting there, my aunts and uncles would talk about, "Oh, this is your grandfather," and they would tell stories about our relatives. And some of the littler, smaller kids, I should say, I can't say littler,
I
smaller
would have
kids.
just gone with it. Sounded good to me.
The smaller children would get bored listening to these stories. They don't want to hear those stories about old people. They would crouch in front of the burning candles and collect the melted wax that was dripping down the sides. And they would collect it and form it into balls. And so when I was writing picture books, I thought I wanted to kind of, to illustrate that experience for a child. And so I thought of this story about a pair of brothers who, they were collecting wax and making these wax balls, and one of them drops their wax ball and it rolls off, and it becomes like a portal into another place. So it's like a scarier place, and they meet this goblin. And so that story was in my head, and I did write that picture book. But later on down the road, I discovered that my picture books were way too long for the market, or for what editors thought was a good picture book story. So I thought, since I write such long picture book stories, maybe I should transition to writing longer pieces. And that's how I started writing novels. And I had that particular story in mind, when I was thinking about writing my first novel. And what I did was I started doing a little bit more research on Philippine cemeteries. And what happened was I came across a blog post by an American missionary who happened to come from Kentucky. I wish I could find that blog post. It's long since it's gone now. I don't know what happened to it. But this American missionary, wrote about his experiences in the Philippines. And in particular, he wrote about these orphan children that he found. He was working with some social workers, and they were encountering all these these orphan children who were living in the cemeteries. And he talked about one particular girl named Grace. And she was 11 years old, and she had been abandoned by her mother, and she begged in the streets to survive, basically. She had no one to take care of her. She would just find wherever place that was relatively safe to sleep in the cemetery. And that's how I discovered, and through that article, I discovered there was a squatter community that lived in the cemetery. They just lived inside mausoleums. Some of them built shanties over these old tomb. I don't know what they're called. We call them apartment tombs in the Philippines, because if you couldn't afford your own plot of land, you could buy a slot in this building. I think they have them in some places here in the States too. And you would be buried, in like this big rectangular building. And, they would have slots for tombs. And so in the Philippines, they call them apartment tombs. And so they built shanties over those too. And I was just fascinated. From then on, I just kept doing, the research just kept going. And I decided at that point, especially the story of Grace, to continue about Grace. This missionary, he was so touched by her predicament, because she would beg for money, but she wouldn't go near any grown-ups. And it was because, as she, like I said, she was abandoned by her mother, so she didn't have very much trust, for grown-ups. Plus, I think she might have been, he suspected, and the social workers suspected that she might have been abused as well. And so he was very disheartened for her and for all those children. So when he came back to the States, he raised money because he wanted to build an orphanage for those kids. And it took him about a year, and he went back to the Philippines, and he was successful. He raised enough money, he built the orphanage, he contacted those social workers that he worked with before, and he went looking for all these children. And he was looking for the little girl named Grace. But he was heartbroken to find out that I'm sorry, hold on. I don't know why my computer is doing this. Okay, sorry.
I'm hanging on your every word. Please continue.
No, because my computer winked out for some reason. I don't know why. It went to sleep. Why? I'm doing something. I don't know why it went to sleep. So anyway, he was heartbroken to find out that this little girl died. He went looking for her, he couldn't find her, and the social worker told him that she passed away. all alone in a charity hospital. And that story just stayed with me. And I thought about, children like her, what it must be like for her, who, especially her, who didn't have any family. Like I said, there's a squatter community in living in the cemetery, and some of the kids that live there live with their families. So they have their moms and dads, brothers and sisters. And although, life is not very comfortable, they don't have running water or bathrooms or things like that, but they had each other, so it wasn't so bad. Versus this girl didn't have anyone. And then I started to think about what it would be like to, for somebody new to come, to be newly homeless and to find themselves in a situation like that. And actually, that's what I just had decided already to write this story, inspired by Grace's experience. But I had to approach it in a way because I've never been homeless myself. So I had to approach the story as somebody who finds themselves newly homeless, and what that would be like to lose everything, or to lose nearly everything, as Nora did, to lose her father and her home, and to have just her and her mother. What would that be like to have a total change? It's like your concept of home is one thing. What would happen when all of that changes? How would she react? So that's how Nora's story was born, pretty much.